lesson tonight, Influence the World. And if you turn to page 40 in your handout, then you'll see the biblical principle there. And the heading, Treaties with Foreigners. Now, as we approach addressing that topic, here's an outline for the chapter which we read in the two sections that we had. First of all, Solomon makes an alliance with Hiram of Tyre. That's verses 1 through 12. And then Solomon organizes a labor force to collect resources for the temple, verses 13 through 18. So as we come to this biblical principle, making treaties with foreigners, because Hiram is the king of Tyre, and they do not belong to the land of Israel. So is it okay for the Israelites to make these treaties with these foreign nations? Now you'll remember that in 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 1, that Solomon married one of Pharaoh's daughters. Remember that? In order to make an alliance with Egypt. And then here in verse 12, we see that it says, the Lord gave Solomon wisdom as he had promised him, and there was peace between Hiram and Solomon, and the two of them made a treaty together. So the question is it okay? Does God want his people to make treaties, to make these alliances with these foreign nations? And so that's what we want to look at first, and then the point that we draw from that will lead us into our final point, which will be the fact that we should influence the world. Now, the first question to consider in whether or not it's okay for the people of Israel to make a treaty is whether or not the land was given to Israel. So, if we consider that, we have Egypt, and the land of Egypt was not given to the people of Israel. And then you have Canaan, and the land of Canaan was given to the people of Israel. So I think that has an important bearing as to whether or not it's okay to make a treaty with them. One of the verses, Deuteronomy chapter 10, verses 18 through 20, this, with respect to Egypt, gives us a little bit of insight of what the Lord is doing. So he says, he administers justice for the fatherless and the widow, and loves the stranger, giving him food and clothing. Therefore love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You shall fear the Lord your God, you shall serve him, and to him you shall hold fast and take oaths in his name. Now what this is referring to is that the people of Israel, they were strangers or foreigners. They lived in the land of Egypt. And they were there, this is before the Exodus in the time of Moses. They were there, I think, about 400 years. So it was quite a significant amount of time. And while they were there, they had a treaty, if you will, or they had an alliance, or they had an agreement or something with Egypt that, they were allowed to live there, and they were allowed to, make their homes and prosper there. It wasn't until you had this Pharaoh who came to power who didn't remember Joseph, and you have the whole leading into the Exodus, that they have trouble there. But that's not characteristic of the whole period of time. And so God uses the fact that they lived in Egypt as kind of a principle for them not to reject foreigners when they come to their land. So when a foreigner comes to your land, God says, you treat them kindly and provide for them because you were a foreigner in Egypt. So just as you were provided for in Egypt, then you provide for the foreigner that comes to your land. So that's one consideration. But you have another consideration also. And this is where you, rather than having an agreement for living, you have, well, I need your help right now. Come make an alliance with me and send your troops and help me be delivered from my enemy. So in Isaiah chapter 30, verses 1 and 2 and 3, it says, Woe to the rebellious children, says the Lord, who take counsel, but not of me, and who devise plans, but not of my spirit, that they may add sin to sin, who walk down to Egypt and have not asked my advice, to strengthen themselves in the strength of Pharaoh, and to trust in the shadow of Egypt. Therefore the strength of Pharaoh shall be your shame, and trust in the shadow of Egypt shall be your humiliation. So in this case, it's not right for the people of Israel to make an alliance with Egypt, because that alliance is based on the fact that they're not seeking the Lord and what he thinks, and they're not trusting in the Lord to deliver. In other words, they're thinking, we're in trouble, this enemy's coming. Egypt has an army, let's make an alliance with them and they'll send their army to help us. In that case, the Lord is not pleased with that kind of alliance, because the Lord wants them to trust in him rather than in Egypt. And so that's not pleasing to the Lord, and in that case, it is not okay to make an alliance with Egypt. Now Solomon is making an alliance through marriage, and that is going to be specifically addressed in, I think it's chapter 11. And so that is not acceptable. The fact that he made an alliance with Egypt is okay, I think, but that he did it through marriage was not okay, and that's going to be a problem. So the way that he went about it, I don't think was, well, it wasn't. It is part of what leads him into sin. Now that brings us to the issue of the Canaanites. And when the people of Israel were getting ready to go into the promised land, God specifically told them, don't make any treaties with the people of Canaan. Now you know that that was the promised land where the Canaanites lived, and that land was being given to them, and God forbid them to make any treaty with the people of Canaan. So it says in Deuteronomy 7, verse 1 and 2, it says, when the Lord your God brings you into the land which you go to possess, and has cast out many nations before you, the Hittites and the Girgashites and the Amorites and the Canaanites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites, 7 nations greater and mightier than you. And when the Lord your God delivers them over to you, you shall conquer them and utterly destroy them. You shall make no covenant with them, nor show mercy to them. And so that was the principle as they were coming into the land of Canaan. The land was being given to them, and they were not to make a treaty with anybody who lived in the land. Now there was a group of people, and they were called the Gibeonites. When the Israelites were attacking, they were fearful for their life because they were Canaanites. They lived there in the land. So they devised this scheme that they would send some messengers to Joshua, have dressed in these old ratty clothes and having disguised themselves as if they had traveled from a far country. So they come to Joshua and they trick Joshua into making an agreement with them that Joshua would not conquer the Gibeonites. So after they make this treaty, it comes out. The Gibeonites tricked you. They don't live far away. They live right here in the land, and you just made a treaty with them. Now, that was a bummer for them, and they all kind of, oh, what did we do? But the interesting thing is that even though they were tricked into making this covenant with the Gibeonites, they did not go back on their word. They didn't come back and say, well, you tricked us, and that was not right. That was not fair. We are not allowed to make a covenant with you, so, nanny, boo-boo, that's just too bad for you. But they didn't do that. They didn't approach it that way. They gave their word before God that they would not harm the Gibeonites, thinking that they were from far away. And even when it was revealed that they had been tricked, they still honored their word because they made their word before God. And so here was an alliance that they should not have made, and yet, in their effort to honor God, they kept their word. That was important. And I think there's a lesson for us to learn from that we should honor our word as Christians. Jesus said in Matthew 5:33, 37, he says, don't swear by heaven or by earth or by Jerusalem, and don't swear by your head because you can't turn one of it white or black. And he concludes with this. He says, let your yes be yes and your no, no. For whatever is more than this is evil. So don't make those vows, and if you do, then make sure that you keep it. But when it comes down to it, if you say yes, if you say you're going to do something, then you do it. And if you say you're not going to do it, then do something and don't do it. In other words, just be simple about it. Yes, let your yes be yes, and let your no be no. And so the people of Israel honored the treaty made with the Gibeonites. Now, interestingly enough, David, years later, Saul is going to have this altercation with the Gibeonites. And David himself, even though he didn't make the treaty, and the treaty was made long before him, he honored the Gibeonites and he came to their aid and protected them. So what we have then is this treaty with the Gibeonites. They shouldn't have done it, but they gave their word before God, and so they were true to their word before God that they were going to keep that treaty and that alliance. Now, one thing is for sure, whether we're talking about Egypt or we're talking about Canaan, or we're talking about anybody, that the people of Israel were not to engage in the practices of these nations. So even if they make a legitimate treaty, like with Egypt, for example, that did not give them license, of course, to enter into the practices of the Egyptians, which were evil. They should not have done that. Solomon, because he married an Egyptian, is going to participate. He weakens over the years towards the end of his life or whatever, and he does end up engaging in the religious practices of the Egyptians. He should not have done that. When God had told them not to make any treaty with the Canaanites, he said, if you make any treaty or alliance with them, or if you allow them to live in the land, then you are going to fall into their practices, and you should not do that. So, regardless, don't do what they are doing. The evil things that they are doing, you're supposed to stay away from that. Instead of being influenced from these foreign nations, you are supposed to be the influencer of them. So that is the lot or the calling of the Christian, if you will. Here we are in this world, and we are Christian, and we are not to be influenced by the world in its evil practices. Instead, as Christians, we are to be the influencer of the world. So we are to be the ones that they choose to emulate, rather than us being the ones that are kind of engaging in their practices. And so this is what happens with respect to the Gibeonites. The Gibeonites are not lumped in with the rest of the Canaanites. From the time of their treaty, the Gibeonites kind of became assimilated into Israel. And they allowed, Israel was the one who influenced the Gibeonites rather than the Gibeonite practices influencing Israel. And it's kind of interesting because during the time of King David, if you remember, there's some passages that talk about David's warriors, his top warriors. So you had the top 3, and then you had the top 30. And there's this name that appears there. One of the names was Ishmaiah the Gibeonite. So I thought that was pretty cool, that here one of the Gibeonites had actually, because they're kind of being assimilated into Israel, he actually becomes one of the top 30 of the Israelite army, or David's chief men there. And we've seen it before. There's Rahab, who gets assimilated, and there's Rachel, who becomes assimilated. So this is not an unusual thing, and it shows the movement in the right direction. The foreigner becomes assimilated into Israel, being influenced by Israel and the God of Israel. And that's how it's supposed to be. Now, when it comes to Tyre and Sidon, there's something pretty interesting here, because these two cities, and you can, if you look on page 43, you'll see a little map there of the northern area of Israel, and the area of Lebanon there. So you have Tyre and Sidon, and these two cities, up until Sidon was kind of the northernmost point of the Canaanite territory. And those two cities, Tyre and Sidon, were given to the tribe of Asher. That's one of the 12 tribes of Asher. Those two cities were given to the 12 tribes of Asher. The tribe of Asher, one of the 12 tribes. So, and here's where I don't have an answer, because during the time of David went around conquering, and he actually conquered up until the cities of Tyre and Sidon. They are included in the census that he takes for the people of Israel. But he does not conquer the cities. Instead, he makes a treaty with Hiram, who is the king of those two cities and of the area. So that is a little bit of a puzzle. I don't know why he did that. I don't think he should have. I mean, if we follow the principle that we've been talking about, he shouldn't have, because the land had been... it talks about how Asher, they tried to take the cities and they were unable to, and so they let the Canaanites stay there. And so David, rather than, even though he had the opportunity, he didn't do it. He didn't kick them out or, battle them and conquer them. He didn't do that. Instead, he makes this treaty with Hiram. Now, I think even in light of that, there's the positive influence of David upon Hiram. Because notice what Hiram says. Once David passes away, Hiram seeks to make an alliance with Solomon, his son. So he wants this treaty, this alliance, to continue. And notice what he says in verse 7. So it was when Hiram heard the words of Solomon that he rejoiced greatly and said, now look at what Hiram says. Hiram the Canaanite pagan of Tyre. Blessed be the Lord this day, for he has given David a wise son over this great people. And I think by the time of Solomon, or through the influence of David, that Hiram has been, kind of won over to the Lord for him to make such a statement as this. And so maybe that's why, well, I don't know why. I mean, David would be the one that would have initiated with him. Now, the interesting thing is that among the wives of Solomon is specifically listed women of the Sidonians. And so he is going to marry some of the women from Sidon, and they are going to also contribute to his departure from the Lord and his wayward. So that's kind of a, I guess, down the road type of thing. And there I have a question, so if anybody has ever heard of anything or you have some insight, I'm open to that. Because I don't know why David would have made a treaty with Hiram, but he did. And Solomon honors that treaty by continuing it during his reign. But the point again, the overall point is that we ought to be the ones who influence rather than be influenced by the world. And this is actually where we want to go now. If you look on page 42, when we bring this to Christ. Christ, of course, came into this world, and we are his people. And for us, the principle is the same. I mean, this biblical principle continues through Christ. And so you have 1 John 2:15, which tells us, do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. And so, as Christians, we are in this world, but we are not of the world, as is kind of the phrase that is commonly repeated. And it's true, in that here we are in this world. When we became Christians, he didn't just kind of beam us up and out of here. We remained here in this world, so we are in the world. But our affections do not lie with the world. They lie with Christ. And so here we're encouraged, and there are many verses, that we're not to allow the world to enter into our heart. We're not to set our affections upon the heart, the things of the world. We are supposed to set our affections upon God. So here we are in this world, and we are not to be influenced by the world, but instead we are the ones who have the message for the world. We are the ones to take the message to the world and to influence them. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 11 and 12. Beloved, I beg you, as sojourners and pilgrims. Now there it is. Those words describe who we are, right? We are sojourners and pilgrims. We are the foreigners in this world. I beg you, as sojourners and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul, having your conduct honorable among the Gentiles. So who are the Gentiles? The Gentiles are the ones who do not believe. Okay? So have your conduct honorable among the Gentiles. So when the world looks at us, we ought to conduct ourselves in an honorable way. We are Christians. We are not to be influenced by the world. We are to be the influencers. That when they speak against you as evildoers, because they're not going to like us, that they, by your good works, which they observe, glorify God in the day of visitation. In other words, at the end of the day, they shouldn't be able to condemn us of anything. That's how we should gear. That's how we should gear our life and live our life here in this world. So we are to be the ones who influence the world. All right. Any questions about anything from this chapter? Colin?
So Solomon had such great wisdom. Why is he making stupid decisions?
When you're lovey-dovey with that sweet thing, and I've said it before, but people will compromise fastest when it comes to a relationship. I don't know how else to put it. And I've seen it over and over again. And Solomon, in order to, he had so many wives, he probably maybe didn't even see them once every year, or maybe multiple years before he came across one of his wives, but a prominent one like the wife of Egypt, who demanded to have her own palace or something. She wanted her place there. So anyways, maybe she was complaining all the time, or maybe she won his heart over, or a combination of everything. He obviously didn't act according to the wisdom that God had given him, and he strayed. And it wasn't just her, but there were the other wives from the other foreign nations.
Maybe it's a don't need to say Gaga beauty.
Yeah. When he looked at them, he went gaga. He went gaga. Yeah, I don't know. It's just they could say, well, if you don't do this for me, I'm going back home, and your alliance is going to be threatened. It could be something like that. With that many wives, I find it hard. The idea of romantic affection kind of goes out the window when you have that many wives, and when you marry for an alliance as opposed to, it's not about romantic love. There are probably other issues involved, which is hard for us as love relationship kind of people in the West here. It's kind of hard for us to understand that there would be any other possibility of entering a relationship, or that there would be any other reason for entering into a relationship other than affectionate, kind of love. Tyson?
I was just going to say, this is just speculation, but because Solomon's wisdom was so, prolific, it was probably not just him going out finding wives, but necessarily other kingdoms looking for
Sure.
alliances.
Sure. That's right. Yeah, the idea of him doing it personally also probably is kind of put by the wayside. So there are a lot of factors here. However, as long as he's walking in the wisdom of God, there is no excuse for him to start, setting up a temple to Moloch and, practicing some of these practices. There is no excuse for that. So at some point he's not using the wisdom of God. He's allowing the passions or whatever. And by passions, I don't necessarily mean the emotional passions of, physical attraction, but he's allowing whatever other things pop up to justify or excuse allowing them to have their ways. It could be something like, I'm from Egypt, and this is the God. This is the God that we worship in Egypt, and I've tried to worship your God, Solomon, but I just can't do it. And you really, I'm really feeling homesick here, and this treaty is being threatened, and you really need to set up something for me so that I can go worship there. And so he, after a while, yields to that, and then she says, well, you're my husband, and you should, maybe come, and you need to, inaugurate it or set it up, and then so it could be things like that. I don't know. But we're just speculating at this point. What it does say is that they turned his heart from the Lord. It says that. And it was his wives who did that. All right, any other questions? Ernie?
It's interesting, I was reading the first verse. It says, for Hiram was ever a lover of David.
Yes.
To me, I get the impression that it's like Jonathan and David kind of relationship.
Yeah.
And whatever David did, Hiram followed along the Jewish belief and line.
Yeah.
Sort of like in the New Testament when you see the centurion who gives to the Jewish temple, I don't think to the synagogue.
Right.
And builds synagogues for them. He's a stranger in the land, in the Jewish land, but he's adopted. You could almost say he's adopted the God of the Jewish.
Yeah, it could be. And it does say that they were close. So whatever happened, Scripture doesn't tell us what happened between David and Hiram to make them so close. And that might be the reason. Maybe, they were good friends, and David said, okay, I'm here, I'm ready to conquer, but because of our relationship, I'm going to hold back and we'll have a treaty instead. It could have been that. That would be a logical kind of conclusion to come to. So again, whatever reason is, they were close and they made a treaty, and by the time of Solomon, Solomon honors the treaty, but it did have its pitfalls because the women of the Sidonians were, some of them were his wife, and they are specifically mentioned as having turned his heart.
But it's like one stranger in the foreign land.
Yeah.
Not really responsible for the sight of women, but he himself could be a believer of Jehovah.
Yeah, I think.
Not converted.
Oh yeah, I think so. I think so. I don't know what the right way for David to have handled it, besides not making a treaty. He didn't have to kill Hiram. He could have just let him come and live in the land. But
Because the greatest thing that the Jewish people were supposed to look after was the widow, the orphan, and the stranger.
right.
All three could basically not support themselves.
Yeah. Now Hiram wasn't a stranger. He maintained his own kingdom there of Lebanon.
But it's part of the Jewish land.
Well, that's right, but they couldn't conquer it. So
So he could be.
yeah, they are.
He could be a stranger who believes.
Yeah, they're a transgressor upon the land for sure. They belong to the people of Israel, but the Israelites were not able to conquer it. But he does believe, I think, from verse 7. And he does have a relationship with David from verse 1. And I think that kind of contributes to David saying, okay, I'm not going to conquer your land. I'm going to let you keep it. And that continues on through Solomon.
It's almost like a respectful love or love out of respect.
That's right. He's respect. That's right. I think so.
So
Yeah.
it didn't carry on. Further generations.
Yeah, all of this is going to shift after Solomon. Because then all bets are off. And everybody's fighting everybody else. Things kind of tumble.
The cities are utterly
Destroyed. Tyre and Sidon kind of hang around for a long time. As a matter of fact, they are mentioned together after this point, rather than Sidon is older than Tyre, but after this point, Tyre and Sidon are kind of the two cities that describe the region, and they're in the prophecies. They're kind of mentioned together, Tyre and Sidon. Jesus will do that. Jesus mentions Tyre and Sidon together. So they continue on until for a long time after this, but of course Hiram's kingdom doesn't, and there's war in this. We'll actually cover some of it as we move through 1 Kings.